It was David Drumm all along. He single-handedly sank the Irish economy. He bailed out the banks to the tune of 64 billion. He implemented a decade of austerity and ruined the lives of tens of thousands of people. Or could there have been a few others involved? Good news, David Drumm has been found guilty. The ex-Anglo-Irish Bank CEO has been found guilty of conspiring with Irish Life and Permanent CEO Dennis Casey, Anglo-Irish Bank Director Willie McAteer and the head of Anglo-Irish Bank Treasury. They were engaged in 7.2 billion worth of fraud. The maximum sentence for this fraud is 10 years in jail, but I doubt very much he'll serve the full 10 years. And the Irish establishment would like you to think that that's the end of the matter. I'm glad David Drumm will be behind bars. All I'm saying is, there's many others who should be behind bars with him. I mean, Sean Fitzpatrick, every bit as corrupt as David Drumm, is every bit as responsible for the banking crisis, and yet he walked free. You see, the whole crash and the subsequent cost that was put on the shoulders of the Irish people was the responsibility of dozens of bankers, developers, and the political establishment. And for that, they're all criminals. Anglo-Irish Bank was always the bank that had links to the developers, but also to the establishment parties, mainly Fianna Fáil, but also Fine Gael. German and French banks were flush with cash. The Germans had been pushing down the wages of their workers and had huge surpluses of cash. So Anglo borrowed that cash and then in turn loaned it to Irish developers. The first phase of the Celtic Tiger was about production of pharmaceuticals and electronics. But as profits from housing escalated and production and profits in the real economy slowed about 2001, the second phase of the Celtic Tiger from 2001 to 2007 was all about inflating a property bubble. Fianna Fáil were happy to inflate this bubble as long as stamp duty kept coming in and as long as they kept getting political support and brown envelopes from the developers. But the whole thing was a house of cards. When the world economy faltered in 2007, it came crashing down. But did the developers pay back the German and French banks? Did they empty their pockets and say, we gambled, we lost, we'll pay up? No, of course they didn't. We paid. Although people like Drumm and Sean Fitzpatrick were responsible for the massive debts that the state took on. It was the politicians who made the decision. The irony being that this mugging of the Irish people was done within the framework of the law. You see, the greatest criminals have the courts on their side. On the 29th of September 2008, Fianna Fáil's Brian Lenihan gave a state guarantee to the Irish banks. By February 2009, we were putting billions into Bank of Ireland and AIB, and soon to put billions more into AIB, Bank of Ireland and Anglo-Irish Bank. The bailout saw the Irish state nationalise the bankers' debts. The nationalisation of the banks wasn't a socialist measure. The nationalisation of the banks was about nationalising their debts and placing them on the balance sheets of the state and putting the taxpayer out of pocket for the sake of bailing out the bankers. Ireland ended up borrowing from the EU IMF loans that came with huge austerity strings attached. We borrowed 67.5 billion from the EU and the IMF, coincidentally very close to the figure we put into the banks. But the bailouts didn't end there. We set up NAMA to buy up the failing properties of failed developers. But the biggest crime of all was the austerity that came as a consequence of the bailout, as a consequence of the failings of Irish capitalism. 1.2 million people now live in poverty. And who was responsible for this criminal act? It wasn't just David Drumm or Sean Fitzpatrick or developers like Johnny Ronan. It was the political class, the TDs in Fianna Fáil, in Fine Gael and in the Labour Party. But the problem is, what court in the land is going to lock up the people who run the Parliament and run the courts and run the civil service and run the country? None of them. It's up to us to replace the Irish state, to rise up and create a state of our own, one that's willing to put them all behind bars.